Welcome to the Independence by Design podcast, where we discuss what it means to be a business owner and ways to get unstuck from the day-to-day so we can design a business that gives us a life of independence. What's up and welcome back. Today I've got Jeff Buettner, who is a partner at ButcherJoseph, an M&A investment banking firm who does sales for multiple different types of buyers, whether it's ESOPs, private equity firms, third-party buyers, which are strategic companies, or management buyouts, family office sales. They are amazing at matching capital with the desired rate of return, hopefully for the seller and the buyer. And if you did not catch last episode with Ken Sangenario and John, I dove into more lessons that I'm trying to learn about understanding the M&A jargon of internal rates of return versus return on assets versus return on equity versus normalized EBITDA, all that stuff that I think we lose sight of. Free cash flow is all that matters with an internal rate of return that matches the owner's goals. Well, the reality is we as the owner operator have to dictate and be clear on our goals of free cash flow and eventual sale price and net proceeds. But we also have different goals that we have, and we want to match those up with different buyers. And the reality is that each buyer has wildly different capital goals based on their structure of their ownership. ESOPs have a different timeline, internal rate of return, of free cash flow and equity valuation targets than a private equity firm. And if it's a private equity firm, each private equity firm will have different timelines and structures and goals. And then if you layer on bolt-on versus an actual platform or a third-party company that has their own strategies of cash flow and equity, or a family office, better understanding the rates of return and free cash flow and value that those different ownership structures need and want is really helpful, because you're going to have to match up an eventual sale of your company to match it up with those goals of those buyers. And I think if I were to look back at the last 400 plus episodes of the podcast, most of the resentment that I hear is because a deal was done and there was not this common understanding of how the structure and the goals of your goals as a seller potentially, and then the future buyer match up, how the deal structure impacts that, and then how the operations and the legacy of the business is going to be impacted based on the foundational structure of the goals of the cash flow and equity based on the shareholders. So sorry if this is a lot, but I just can't stop thinking about this. And this is really the name of the game of M&A, but you don't have to sell right now. And the only way we can determine whether we should or shouldn't sell and answer the question, is this worth it or not, is by understanding, if you were to go to the market, what are the trade-offs? What's the difference between an ESOP sale, a private equity sale, and a third-party sale? Well, knowing this stuff is going to help you better understand whether you should even focus on taking the company to market, or if you should. And so Jeff does a great job, because they are in the market in M&A, understanding capital matching based on risk and return and timelines and buyers. And then next week, I've got Dave Deal, who is a CEO of Prairie Capital Advisors, who's another M&A investment banking firm and with a similar setup as ButcherJoseph. And he and I are going to dive really deep into deal structures just in general, because again, the purchase price is the tip of the iceberg. And then after Dave, Ken Sangenario is coming back on the show again in order to put a huge bow around all this, so we can make this practical for you who most likely doesn't want to deal with all this stuff. However, if we are being taken advantage of with our time, knowing this stuff is the only way I truly believe we can have more independence over our time, because deciding how to spend our time and place our bets is the most important thing we can do as an owner operator and as an entrepreneur and capital allocator. And this stuff that we're talking about is what I believe creates freedom, because we better understand whether we should take that phone call, sell the company, place another bet in the business. I mean, that's really what we're doing as capital allocators and time allocators. This is the stuff that we need to know in order to get there. So I really hope you enjoy this episode with Jeff Buettner. Don't forget to stay tuned to Dave Deal next week. And then the week after that is Ken Sangenario. And if you haven't listened to last week's with Ken and John, I highly recommend doing so. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Don't forget that Spotify also has the video tied into the episode, and share this with a friend or give it a rating if you appreciate it. Thanks everybody for tuning in. All right, Jeff, here's my thoughts on this topic. And I'll be happy to repeat this again once we do the whole countdown and then get started. But I thought I'd give you a little bit of forwarding where I want to head with this conversation.
Yeah.
So, and again, I'll repeat this. so my listeners can hear, but the big decision of my clients, so I've got about 15 personal clients, Jeff, between $1 million and a few $1 million in normalized EBITDA. I've built this ownership framework that they are now following. So it's no services, or just they're set on, I need to extract myself from the operations and become capital allocator. Like that's what they're grabbing onto. And I've worked on a framework of like, you got to understand what you want out of free cash flow. And then you got to understand what your wealth targets are and your equity targets and how your business can be the vehicle to get you there. With the 3-statement model that I suggest people getting in place, with a 3-statement model, they can see, if it's mathematically tied together, they can see their working capital, their reinvestment, and their distribution and their taxes, and then what the free cash flow is after that. Mm-hmm. And once they can hit their annual income needs from that, while also hiring the $250,000, $300,000 CEO, mm-hmm. they got to make sure that they have the safety free cash flow that doesn't suffocate the valuation growth. And so like everything I'm talking about is like, how do you make sustainable cash flow for yourself after taxes, distributions, after taxes, working capital, and reinvestment? That inherently de-risks the weighted average cost of capital and allows you to do management buyout, recap, ESOP, private equity, and justify the return that you want. Mm-hmm. And so as I've been doing this, I'd be happy to restate this, by understanding all this financial jargon has been my mission, and then helping the commercial cleaners, the electrical contractors. I mean, one of my clients got a $35 million electrical contractor business. He's like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. It's like, but he understands free cash flow. Mm-hmm. And then he understands the multiple is the inversion of the weighted average cost of capital and company specific risk. Mm-hmm. How the different buyers look at like the different buyers' tax structure and their cost of capital will dictate how much they can pay, mm-hmm. and how much they can pay up front. Mm-hmm. So like what I was thinking about going through is like me restating this. You feel free to on the record course correct me. I'm just on a journey learning this stuff, Jeff. So and that my clients and audience are listening in and learning too. But once we kind of set the stage of like, here's how these terms and these things work. At the end of the day, it's free cash flow for my clients and then net proceeds. And it's multiple EBITDA, net debt, and working capital. But then the buyer's situation will impact how much can be paid, mm-hmm. how much can be paid up front. And like your spectrum of offerings, I think can help them better understand, like, it's not like everything's not treated equal. Mm-hmm. Am I making sense? Do you want to like course correct me before I hit record, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, what I'm hearing is what you want to do is you want to sort of introduce the idea that there's a buyer who has its own issues basically to deal with, and their issues will dictate how they approach your business regardless of anything you've done.
Well said. Maybe we should just let that be the liftoff point. Yeah, like well said. And actually, let's just, if we want, just include that. And I'll restate what I was saying, Jeff, is so kind of the tee us up here is, so my clients and the audience listening in, as I've honed in on the owner operator profile, let them truly understanding how to extract themselves from the operations. And then their goal is a couple of things. One is to understand their trade-offs over time, cash flow now versus equity tomorrow. Because it's always this trade-off of taking cash flow versus growing equity, and having that thought process and that framework, Jeff, allows them to then have decision-making capability of saying, should I reinvest back in the business? What would my return be? But one of the first couple of things that people have to do when they understand this is build the 3-statement model, and otherwise we're guessing. So if we have this framework to say, in the next 2 to 5 years, if I have a mathematically tied together income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement with my projections, I should be able to get visibility in the middle of the year, over years in the future, what my working capital needs would be, because that's the use of cash, what my taxes will be, and then how much is left over to then reinvest or take in distributions. And one of those constraints for my clients and people listening is, it's like, I got to get out of the operations to have choices. And that might not necessarily be to sell, but there's going to be options. And like, there's this like this bell curve, Jeff, of like people want 20 to 50 grand a month net. You know what I mean? Like that's not private plain money or anything like, but the middle market, it's like, hey, if I can maintain, 2 to 500 grand in, cash flow after taxes while someone else is running my company, then I have a lot of choices. And then the question becomes, when I reinvest that money, I need to be able to make sure that I'm getting the return. And therefore, the thought process in my material is de-risk that cash flow, because you're reducing the weighted average cost of capital and growing the multiple. So like there's a lot of ways and systems that I talk about how to de-risk that cash flow, but know what the hell you're going to do with the money if you're going to reinvest it. But then there's this time where like when they go to sell, because like the first, like while they're running the company, free cash flow is the name of the game. But by maintaining sustainable and consistent cash flow from themselves, they're growing the valuation. So like their goals are actually met or are lined up with having more options when the valuation's growing. But as I've been going down this rabbit hole, Jeff, and this is why I'm excited for this conversation, is there's private equity and ESOPs and management buyouts and strategic buyers. They have their own calculations that they run when the deal is presented, and you're the intermediary there. And what I talk about is at the end of, when you go to a transaction, you have to have the normalized EBITDA, the multiple based on that risk of the cash flow and the WACC, net debt where you keep your cash, you pay off the debt, and then you deliver a normal level of working capital. Then that buyer is going to take that situation, extrapolate their own analysis, right? Which will impact what someone's willing to pay. And so you work with multiple different types of buyers, but even in like just the PE sector, there's going to be their own nuances. And so that's a lot of Ryan talking, but I'm hopefully helping put the container around this, because you see a lot of different things and what the buyers are, what nuances should these sellers be thinking about as they're weighing their choices of like, keep the company and the return. Do I sell it? When and how, and what buyers should I look at? So that's a lot. Sorry, but like hopefully that gives you some framework to what's on my mind.
Yeah, no, I think I got it. That's helpful insight, and makes sense. So yeah, we can run with that.
Let's talk about the different types of buyers that you guys talk, like the different categories of buyers, and then we can talk about how they analyze the value that they're willing to pay and what their ultimate goals are.
Right. Okay.
So what are the main categories of buyers that you're like, when a seller comes to you and said, okay, Jeff, I'm looking to exit my ownership?
Yeah. So, I mean, generally speaking, I'd say there are financial buyers and there are strategic buyers. Those are the two primary categories, right? With financial buyers being comprised of private equity firms, family offices, but I would also throw an ESOP structure in there as sort of a financial buyer. I'd throw management sort of in there as a financial buyer. Strategics is another category. Generally, I'd say what we mean by strategics is someone that's in the, runs an operating business. It is an operating business.
An entity willing to buy the assets that you have for a reason, right?
That kind of has an operations, that is manufacturing something or building something, and or providing a service, maybe similar or not too dissimilar from, the target company's business. But the interesting thing is strategic businesses can be owned by private equity. Strategic businesses can be owned by family offices. So, you can kind of have this little bit of a hybrid, sort of, buyer universe where, yeah, it's a strategic buyer, but it's backed by private equity. And that has, that's important to note, because
implications, right? Because you could have another strategic buyer that's backed by a family office or a third generation family. And like the reason that I've gathered that, like from my deals that I've been a part of, is like, it depends on the sophistication of that buyer's understanding of value and what they're planning on doing. Because at the end of the day, like where I've landed, Jeff, is like, if free cash flow and internal rate of return for the shareholders is what matters, it depends on whether the buyer understands that or not, and how they're going to finance the structure and what their level of scrutiny of figuring that equation out is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and these different universe of buyers have different motivations, right? And so they have different return profiles. They might have different costs of capital. that impacts, the hurdle rates.
Can you let's double click on that, because that's one of the things that I'm trying to hammer home to people is like, the multiple that's loosey goosey thrown out all over the place and the ranges, but like at the end of the day, it's the hurdle rate and the cost of capital of the buyer that will dictate
Mhm.
how they treat the deal, how much they pay, and what they do with it. Can you explain from your perspective what you mean by that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so a financial buyer, like a private equity firm, is really going to be looking at what their return on investment is. So if they are borrowing money at a cost of X percent, they need to generate some sort of return over and above X percent, right?
And
And
that X percent is coming from the share or the investors the equity they raised, right? And their target, and then the debt as well, the blend.
yeah, I mean, it's they're these financial buyers are usually financing their transactions with some sort of equity component, and they're borrowing money, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you've got to be able to generate a rate of return that's attractive. That number one covers your cost of capital, but number two is attractive to those limited partners that is a return profile that they couldn't get necessarily elsewhere. If you can get 5-6% in a checking account or a savings account at a bank, why would you take a heightened level of risk to get a 6 or 7% return, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
not worth
Mm-hmm.
the incremental return profile. So you need to have, in the private equity firms, as they underwrite to their purchase price, they're going to want to understand the future cash flows of the business and how maybe they can improve the future cash flows of the business, so that they certainly have a targeted rate of return in their minds of what they want to be able to achieve off in a particular investment. And what does this company need to do to produce that rate of return for the investors?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And here's where, like, I honestly, Jeff, have got my over the years, I've like wrapped my head around an axle of like trying to like, because these terms and goals get so convoluted. Because okay, so bear with me here. is so that PE firm raises the equity with a target IRR of 23% or 21 or whatever the goal is from their investors, who are pension funds, endowments, insurance companies, wealthy individuals. Then they also get the debt and they blend that together to say, this is my hurdle rate, right? And the interesting part is, because debt's cheaper, they are able, the goal, I mean, this is where a lot of challenges could happen depending on the PE firm and their approach. You could over leverage it because you're trying to stretch to get that return by over leveraging the
Oh,
situation.
for sure. No, they want to put as much debt on it as reasonably possible because of the fact that the debt is cheaper than equity. And it allows them, by putting more debt on it, it allows them to have a better opportunity to generate the type of return that they're trying to achieve.
Right, which then therefore counter or conflicts with free cash flow and the ability to reinvest free cash flow or take distributions.
Well, on a go forward basis, post transaction,
Yeah.
right? You've got a
Yeah.
much more heavily levered company. Okay, so you're still going to have the same working capital requirements. You're still going to have the same types of CapEx investments. You might even have more if you've got to make some growth CapEx, right?
Yeah. Based on the
But
target, like,
yeah,
growth projections,
and
right?
so all those cash flows that you traditionally generated, on a post transaction basis, you'll still have. Plus, now you're going to have fixed charges. What do I mean by fixed charges? I mean principal payments and interest payments. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got to slot that in your cash flows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to be able to cover, on a levered basis, all of your fixed charges and your working capital needs. There may not be a whole lot of room left over for distributions on a go forward basis, but that's okay, because you're a private equity firm that's not necessarily maybe taking a distribution each year like you did as a founder owner,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well,
I
that would
mean,
be that's where, like, what my philosophy is, Jeff, for everybody, is that if the owner operator who's not highly levered, this is where it's so counterintuitive for my audience, because it's like the situation gets inverse after the transaction. Because let's say one of my clients is collecting 100K in distributions after taxes, working capital, while they currently own the company, and they're paying down debt. Here's what's super fascinating to me is, like, so as they're paying down debt, their net proceeds will be dollar for dollar more when they sell, but they're actually by paying down debt, they're actually increasing, while they own their company, increasing the weighted average cost of capital because equity is more expensive. But if we can show that they can maintain 100K in after-tax distributions, we could flip that to debt and leverage, as long as we've been able to prove in a TTM basis that they've been able to do this, or and prove that they can do this. It just shows that someone else can put more leverage on the business and be confident with that. So am I thinking about, this is where I get so interestingly wrapped around the axle, because on the current owners have like almost a different game than the potential buyer.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I would say it a little bit differently. I mean, you've got maybe currently an owner of a business has distributions running through the statement of cash flows, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On a post-transaction basis, if somebody else comes in, those distributions go away, but in lieu of that, you've got fixed charges. So if you can replicate dollar for dollar,
right,
what the distribution, what the principal and interest payments going forward will be, with what the distributions would have been otherwise, it's 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? That founder owner sold his company. He's not getting any distributions.
Right. But
right?
But we're proving in the cash flow statements that like this repeated distribution is possible. We're paying the, so yes. Like let's say it was
a level of distributions is something that the business has been able to attain. Right. And now so that's sort of proof is in the pudding there. And so simplistically, someone could come in and say, well, that's what I'm going to triangulate my my investment to, is to make those exact same dollars. It's just, instead of dollars going out the door from this company in the form of a distribution to this guy who sold, because he sold, now it's going to the banks, right? In the lending community from which I got capital. And you could, as the buyer, say, well, do I have room to maybe squeeze a little bit more juice out of this, orange? And maybe that guy's been taking a certain distribution that's comfortable, but the business could actually, you could push this a little bit further, put a little bit more debt on it.
We're doing way too much R&D that's tinkering around.
Yeah, whatever it is. We don't need to do R&D. We can cut back expenses. If we drive revenue, then we can put a little bit more debt on it. And you've got to balance more debt with the cost of debt. Which in this, latest 18-month period has been a challenge, because the cost of debt has skyrocketed and gone so high, which means, all else being equal, you can't put as much debt on
it. and the returns are going to be lower. But like, back to this is where I think that this is where I've been honing in on, Jeff, with all my clients, because when they have that information,
the returns aren't going to be any lower. Right. Well, private equity is not going to want to underwrite to a lower return. They got to keep their same return. So some other lever in the equation has to change.
Thank you for thank you for saying.
If they want an 18% rate of return, it doesn't matter. They want an 18% rate of return.
They have to, for the Ontario's.
That means something else has to change.
Yeah. Well, and why that is, because they raised money from Ontario's teachers pension fund, hypothetically, or whatever police department, and said, we're going to give you more money so you can pay these people $2,800 a month for the rest of their life. And they don't have a choice. But I think that this is why, as we hone in on this as the foundation for the rest of the conversation, these buyers' unique situation. So then in that situation, what I'm trying to help people with, Jeff, is extrapolate, what does that mean for my company if I were to sell it? So they need to squeeze more juice out of, or either they want to or they need to your point, but that will then ripple into what levers will have to be pulled, which is, trying to drive that growth with less expenses, or reducing there's going to be something that has to give that might impact their culture and their company long-term, but it has to be done, right?
Yeah, on a post-transaction basis, the private equity firm will make operational and strategic decisions that assist them, right, in generating the return profile. And it could be, hey, we're going to drive revenue because we're going to be able, on a post-transaction basis, to change the sales trajectory because we have all of these new relationships that we can bring to this business that the company couldn't get on a status quo basis. Right, under the ownership of the founder, because they've got all these relationships from, whatever context they have in the business world. Or it's going to be, hey, we're going to reduce the workforce by 10%, or we don't need 2 factories, or,
Mhm.
we're just going to
Or,
reduce
or even to like,
R&D.
or like, and I think, yeah, all of those, but I think you're hitting on such an important part, and that this is an important piece of context before we move on to management buyouts and ESOPs, because this is going to be completely different from how they think about it. But from like a PE, strategic perspective, what you just described is each buyer, and you guys do this for a living, like, will have a different idea of how they're going to pull those levers. But like you said, like maybe one PE firm has the synergies and the board and the general partners are going to apply those relationships to drive revenue. Or there's this massive assumption of we're going to hire Jeff, and he's this magical, sales wizard that is going to implement Salesforce, and we're going to randomly, but like, how accurate are those assumptions? And what does that do to the operations and the stress of the organization?
Yeah. No, it could be very stressful to the organization, depending upon how, how difficult it is, and how much, meat you have to cut from the bone, for lack of a better word. I mean, you talk about private equity as a buyer, there's even, you got to kind of look a little bit one layer deeper into that too, because sometimes private equity is buying a business because they want to use that business as a platform company. It's their first investment in some sort of industry. They want to establish a new sort of, vertical industry, in their portfolio, and they need a company to be that platform. And their intention is then to ultimately bolt onto that platform other businesses, right? And so, they might think a little bit differently about a platform company versus a bolt-on acquisition to a platform company.
Yeah, and let's for the
In terms of
audience,
what in terms of what a founder owner's business represents, right?
right.
How they would approach the transaction.
Well, and from that internal rate of return perspective and what levers they have to pull,
Mhm.
it's important, I think, for the audience, if they're the seller, is to understand, are you the platform, and how
Yeah.
is that IRR going to ripple into you, versus if you're the bolt on, they're going to figure out how to generate that return through synergies.
Correct, and if you're the bolt-on and they've already got a platform company and they made 3 or 4 different acquisitions, there may be fewer, it may be easier to introduce relationships and to drive sales, right? Because you've already got relationships in a different territory, and you're making a product that we can pick up and sell into this territory that the founder owner's company never sold into that territory because it
Hmm.
never had those relationships.
Hmm.
Um, or you can, again, you have a increased number of salespeople that can sell multiple products now, right? And,
Hmm.
and as a private equity firm that's already made 2 or 3 acquisitions, adding a third one, maybe it's a little bit easier of a lift
Yep.
for
Yep.
that
Yep.
seller, to see how the changes going forward might be a little bit less disruptive to their business, as opposed to maybe a company that was the initial platform company.
And like, your role in that situation is to understand how to match up the buyer's intentions with the seller's intentions. And the way I think about this, Jeff, is like, okay, so out of 425 podcast interviews over 9 years, Jeff, like, it's always this mismatch of intentions and and not even, okay, let me rephrase that. Sorry. It's not a mismatch of intentions, it's the mismatch of assumptions and the probability of those assumptions actually coming to reality. And so I think it's so important for the sellers to be like, what are the assumptions that the private equity firm or the strategic or the bolt, like, what are the assumptions being placed on my situation? Because if it's like la la land, it's like that la la land will come home to impact that buyer or that seller situation. For example, I had one of my old clients, actually his tombstone's behind me. I give a referral to a different firm 5 years ago. He calls me up, Jeff, he goes, I quit. And I'm like, okay, what happened? He sold his company for 50 million bucks. He's like, it's a disaster. And that was because I know a lot about his operations and the valuation, all this stuff. And I'm like, dude, do you still have that AS 400? He's like, uh-huh. And I'm like, because there's zero integration. Deloitte's getting paid $90,000 a week. It's just a burning disaster. And this is like story number 5 or 6 in the last like couple months of like the 20 to $50 million sale price, where like I've been doing this long enough where it's been 36 to 48 months where those assumptions from the get-go are ridiculous. But like what happened was the seller didn't understand what assumptions were being placed on that deal. Whereas in the seller understands the operations and the probability of that stuff probably getting done. And then there's just like, well, like, and that's why I go back to the assumptions of the buyer and how the buyer needs to get that return and the assumptions that they use. Talk like, what do you think about that? How you are seeing these? Maybe we can focus on private equity first. How important understanding those assumptions are to match up the buyer and seller? Because I mean, that's what you guys do every day.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly what we do every day. I mean, I think it always sort of. I hate to say this, but it always sort of depends, right? On sort of facts and circumstances. I mean, some sellers that we've worked with of businesses are looking to maybe step back from the operations, and they're sort of less concerned about what happens on a go forward basis. And I think back like 5 years ago, and there was an environment 5 years ago where, most of the sellers at that time could probably expect to get, almost all cash at close, and they'd walk out of the transaction pretty, free and clear to go off and do something else. But that environment really sort of doesn't exist any longer. A lot of the buyers are looking for the founder owners that are selling the business. The buyers want kind of a little bit of their continued support of the business going forward for a little while, right?
Is it because of the lending environment, or is it because that these buyers? Well, I think from my personal unique experience, I've seen that there's a lot more amateur buyers out there that are doing this that had like a bad situation of all those assumptions that didn't come to fruition. So now they're like, I just need Jeff to stick around to make sure that we actually hit those. I mean, like what is resulting in that, do you think?
Yeah, I think it just provides greater assurances as a buyer on a go forward basis that for the next couple of years, there's some consistency. I mean, it's hard to replace somebody who's maybe been running the business for say 30 or 40 years, right? I mean, you can bring in somebody sophisticated and smart, but obviously to the extent you've got this asset, this individual that you can use in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's not full time, but maybe it's some way, part time. I mean that only helps ensure that the company continues to perform in the first couple of years post transaction while you get the rest of the team up to speed. I think there's another piece of the puzzle that in these transaction structures today that are commonly used as something called an earnout, where again the seller is not necessarily getting 100 cents on the dollar at close, but asked to maybe take a little less purchase price up front, and then get a second sort of bite at the apple if the company sort of achieves certain growth objectives. And even without an earnout, there's a lot of times where founder owners that sell their company to somebody are asked to sort of roll a certain percentage of equity into the deal post transaction.
Yep.
So to get back to your original question, when you've got some sort of risk sharing like that as a founder owner in some form or fashion, you're probably going to be a little bit more motivated to know like what the risk is that that the company.
What's the assumptions that were made on this?
Assumptions like what are the assumptions that you're using to generate this return, and what that upside might mean for me, and particularly if it's in the form of an earnout. If you've got these wild, crazy assumptions that I just know are never going to hit, then I'm pretty much going to look at that earnout as being worthless right out of the gate. And I'm not going to discount the value of that before I even get to transaction close. Because I think that those assumptions are so far unachievable that I'm never going to see any incremental dollars a year or two down the line. Right.
Yeah.
So,
And Jeff, what I think is so fascinating of like, I've got multiple clients that I've been working on, whether it's management buyouts and, in different internal leveraged buyouts where, well, let me actually, before I go to that, let me go back. So in that situation where you got earnout, rolled equity, or et cetera. So like I have beat the drum into my clients and my audience that we have to understand. So if we have this assumption that, okay, Jeff, you're making $50K a month in distributions after taxes while someone else is running your company. So if you extract yourself, you're on the board roughly. And that's not That's easier said than done, but there's a process to getting there. But then at some point, if you monetize that, I have it where my clients, they have a very clear picture of net proceeds after taxes, like what they need to make that deal worth it. Because and this is where this conundrum has risen up, Jeff, is that if we're now thinking like capital allocators, and the hurdle rate of the weighted average cost of capital and the return, the IRR that we need for our company, we're using the build-up methodology to make decisions. So now here's what ends up happening. All right, Jeff, you're making $500,000 after taxes. Here's what the growth projections are. And then it's like, well, we would need to, like, hypothetically, you would need to net $5 million. But then what happens is we go, okay, well, now let's say Jack's buying the company, and like, you're not going to get that much money up front. And now all of a sudden, because it's truly an IRR decision. And it's like, wait a second. Okay, so we don't get $5 million up front. Now you got this rolled equity, you got this earnout. Why in the hell would you sell your business? And then it's like, okay, well, even if you got the $5 million, here's what it's so fascinating to me, Jeff, is so we got the $5 million. Let's say you do get all the cash up front, and we literally, as an investor, go through the build-up methodology for the cost of equity. We say, okay, well, treasuries, that's shit return. Then we go to the S&P 500. Then we go to size premium. Then we go to industry. You know what we end up doing? We end up buying the commercial cleaning company that's kicking out $1 million in cash, which is our business. And so, like, it's this weird, like, the snake eating its tail. And that's where the deal structure and the buyer's ability to get that cash up front based on the sustainable cash flow is important. And the assumptions become so important, which I don't know if you want to speak to that in the private equity space, but this is where it's so fascinating when we look at management buyouts, ESOPs that free up tax. But what do you think about what I'm like, the situation that my clients are being presented with? I mean, are we thinking about it the right way?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, there's a huge decision tree, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of just kind of understanding, what the economics of a transaction might mean, to a founder owner of a business, and a lot of times when you sort of go through it, you might find that, well, this on the face of it was, nice to see. It may not be quite as actionable as I thought it was, because maybe the deal, isn't quite as attractive as maybe I thought it was for a variety of reasons. The ESOP, you mentioned the ESOP piece. I think that's something that I think is actually been a much more interesting sort of trending transaction structure as of late, because of the significant tax attributes that can accrue to the founder owner in a sale. I mean, it's the only structure that allows you to essentially sell your business and not have to pay capital gains. Now it has to be structured a certain way for you to take full
The C
advantage
Corp
of it.
1042, right?
Yeah, Section 1042, right? But if you think about that, and if you've got an owner of a business where obviously the amount of net proceeds are important, which for most business owners, it is.
Yeah.
Now that's not always the case, because believe it or not, some business owners have
Yep.
taken massive distributions over the year, and
Yep.
they're like, I've got more money than I need. I don't necessarily need to maximize top dollar. I just want a fair price. But for others, the net proceeds is a huge part of like making sure that this is an actionable decision. And sometimes, with private equity, they're, particularly in today's environment, the purchase price multiples aren't as high as they were 2 years ago.
And then
so,
the deal structure complications,
and
right?
then the deal structure complicates it. And so you might find that, hey, on a net after-tax basis, if I don't sell to an ESOP, I'm getting something equivalent to what I could get if I sell to an ESOP, or maybe the ESOP could even be a little bit better on a net after-tax basis, depending on some of these variables. But I think the biggest thing that I think, kind of coming back to the start, that I think the biggest issue that a lot of owners of businesses face, and maybe some of the mistakes that they often make, or maybe it's not mistakes, but the misunderstanding that a lot of founder owners essentially have, is they tend to think that all buyers are equal and all transactions are equal, right? And that's not necessarily the case. And so one of the things we've done over the years is we've developed like this feasibility product, which basically assists founder owners with choosing which door they want to choose, right? Door number one is selling to a strategic buyer. Door number two is selling to private equity. Door number three is maybe a management buyout. And door number four is a is an ESOP structure, and here are the pros and cons to each one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what the value might look like, and here are the implications to your employee base, and you tell us what's important. We're pretty agnostic on which door you choose, right? But
Mm-hmm.
this tool that we felt like gives that founder owner an opportunity to see, all different flavors that exist, and
Mm-hmm.
then have an informed decision as to which door they want to choose and which path they want to go down. And we can take them down whichever one they want, but at least they've
Which
got,
is why I've always liked working with you guys, because
yeah,
so many people are trying to jam. Oh, they only offer one door. So
right.
like, all roads lead to this. And like, but like what's, and that's super fascinating. And like, when I think about what I've worked on for the last decade, Jeff, is like, the legacy. So there's the, how much do you need at closing for your wealth and your financial retirement need, or just your target return. Either one of those are correct based on their goals. But then there's the legacy and the culture and all that stuff. But then why I started with the weighted average cost of capital and where these buyers are getting their money and what their needs are, is it's about aligning those doors and those options with the assumptions. And what I've learned, Jeff, after all my workshops with these owner operators, it's like I keep going back to, like, if this iPhone, like you and I, if we're going to trade this in capitalism and consumer, like you and I need to both understand that this thing's worth about $1,100. But like, we can't even have a discussion around trading this if you have no idea what it's worth. Like, how are we going to talk about Droid versus iPhone if you think it's worth $100,000 and I think it's worth 1,000? So like, what I've been trying to do is like, how the hell are these companies valued? Well, it's based on the risk of the cash flow and the discounted cash flow, and then the transaction. But then that buyer, what they do with it afterwards and what that structure will absolutely impact you, which therefore impacts all the shit you care about, which is your legacy, your employees, your like. So by understanding like the true go back to like the cash flow statement of the ESOP, if the desire for the ESOP, so let's talk about like, the PE firm needs an internal rate of return for the pension fund or endowment or whoever they raise their money from, has to, within 5 to 10 years, like fiduciary obligation. The ESOP, and the PE firm pays taxes, right? So they're paying taxes and they got loaded up with debt and they've got all these assumptions, and ESOP frees up the tax and the cash flow statement, which in Minnesota here, by the way, is a lot. So like, you sit there and go, okay, well, now what is the ability for that post-transaction to service the debt? And so like, let's talk about the assumptions on that ESOP. And when you're working with the trustees from an ESOP, what is the ESOP looking at to make sure that they're taken care of, and how like, what kind of assumptions are they thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's a financial transaction. You're putting debt on the balance sheet. So on a post-transaction basis, obviously, one of the things you want to make sure is that the company's got the ability to cover the fixed charges, principal and interest payments, and obviously that's a big part of making sure that you've got a transaction that's, number one, structured appropriately, and number two, priced appropriately, right? I mean, there's only so much cash flow that a company can generate, and obviously, if you can grow the business and increase cash flow, that increases, that provides more of a cushion, right? But you want to know, obviously, well, if the business continues to operate in a certain way, what sort of principal and interest payments can this company afford given the CapEx needs? And CapEx needs comes in two forms. Number one, it's maintenance CapEx. That's just, the normal stuff each and every year you got to do. And then number two, it's growth CapEx, right? And one of the things you don't want to do is necessarily overburden the company with so much unproductive cash flow obligations, unproductive meaning principal and interest payments, that all of a sudden now you don't have the ability to have any capital for growth CapEx needs. And if you don't have capital for growth CapEx needs, then obviously you're impacting the growth trajectory of the business. You're impacting the company's ability to increase revenue, increase earnings, to grow value. And in some cases, what we've seen is that you're almost putting the company at a competitive disadvantage because you might be competing with another company out there that doesn't have as much debt on the balance sheet, and they can afford to modernize. They can afford to make acquisitions, whereas you can't, because all of your capital is leaving the door to go pay principal and interest charges. And so you got to make sure when you structure these leverage buyouts, which is what they are, a leverage buyout, that you understand the future cash needs of the business, and you've got a structure that's durable enough to support the company's growth objectives alongside its debt obligations, not just in the status quo, but also in
based
sort
on
of
the return that the new shareholders need.
yeah,
Yeah.
but also on a downside, like what happens if all of a sudden something changes in the world? You know, we have
Yep.
another COVID environment, or we go into a recession, and how much downside do I have before this debt really starts to become a noose around my neck and
Hmm.
really impacts my ability to grow the business?
Yep.
Obviously, in the best case scenario, the company continues to grow and thrive, and
Hmm.
revenue and earnings continue to rise, and margins increase, and that's a home
Up
run.
and to the right, 45
Yeah,
degree angles.
up and
Perfect.
to the right. That's a home run, and you wanna know what that scenario looks like too, frankly.
Right, right, right.
Just to kinda know, all right, well, if that happens, then how quickly can we repay the debt? And once we
Yep.
repay the debt, then what do we do? We can't just,
Yep.
we should be thinking strategically as a leadership team,
Yep.
on a go-forward basis, and so, maybe
But
make
Jeff,
acquisitions.
what is interesting, I'm tracking 100%. And what I think is, just to compare and contrast the ESOP situation compared to the PE situation that you said, the private equity firm and all of them uniquely different have their own tax structure, their own borrowing abilities, and then they're going to place some assumptions of what they can do with the business. There's probably some conversations that you're helping with the seller saying, like, what is realistic so we can actually build this model out. With the ESOP, the sellers actually being able, because it's a financial transaction with the trustee and with yourself, right? Where like that planning that, so like my clients are working on that stuff, right? So like they're painting that picture saying, here's what we would need for growth CapEx, here's what we need for normal CapEx, and so like you're building that story and like engineering the outcome with essentially just thinking like a PE or an ESOP private equity firm as yourself. But with the ESOP, you're freeing up that tax chunk of the cash flow,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
that
versus the
piece alone
PE,
yeah,
right?
that piece alone is, it's cash that instead of going to Uncle Sam can be used to repay the debt and give you that much
Right.
more, sort of downside protection. And
But isn't that where
number one,
the repurchase obligations are also?
that starts
So
to
like
come into
depending
play.
on how old people
Yeah,
are in the
yeah,
retirement ages.
yeah, that starts to come into play too. Usually that it becomes a little bit more of an issue after the company's been ESOP owned for like 10 years. You usually don't see it become that too concerning in the first 10 years for a variety of reasons. The other thing about the ESOP as a buyer versus private equity is, private equity is gonna, and you touched on it earlier, they're gonna have an exit at some point, right? And so they're gonna need 5 to 7 years or whatever their hold period is to sell the company and have their own liquidity event. And so you kind of get into this perpetual transaction sort of structure, right? And whereas the ESOP is going to be a much more long-term patient investor, right? You don't have to stay in the ESOP structure forever, but there's no like immediate plans to 5 to 7 years later, sell the company. Certainly, if a right opportunity comes along, some company approaches you in the ESOP structure and says, "Hey, you're a great business. We want to own you." The board and the trustee can make that decision at the time. But that's the other big piece of it. And I think when we talk to founder owners in our feasibility process, that's they start to wonder about, well, do I want to kind of put my company in this perpetual state of transactions? Like what happens after 5 years? I mean, my employer is going to go through one transaction, and then 5 years later, my employee is going to go through another transaction, and it's super disruptive, and maybe there's
Well,
better
how many
ways
of those
to think about it.
assumptions have to be done in 5 to 7 years? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, from operating my own business, it's like things take a while.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of time. Life's a quick period for if you want if you're trying to sell something you just bought in 5 years, you need to put things into place now.
I know,
You don't
I
have time
know.
to
Like,
wait a couple years.
oh yeah, like, oh, that ERP system that we tried to implement took another 2 years. Oh, by the way, like, and that's where like those assumptions of what has to happen in that 5 to 7 years is so important for sellers to understand. But also with the ESOP, going back to, if you're painting your picture of like, so like with my clients, if they're putting in like the 5 year 3 statement projections, assuming their working capital, their growth investment, their distributions, that free cash flow allow them to either take the distributions right now or convert that to debt, free up some taxes to then pay off some more debt. But then that what to do with that growth CapEx. That's where I've been working. There's different systems out there, Jeff, like how to de-risk that cash flow, how to assess what strategies you need to invest to de-risk that cash flow and grow the multiple. They're taking so much control over it. And this is why I find it such a fascinating decision tree, because if you don't get enough money, here, let me see if I can frame this up. If the seller doesn't get enough money up front in a third party sale, you might as well keep the freaking company or do an ESOP, because like if you're going to be hooked up with someone else that's never ran a business before, that doesn't know your industry, and now you got to chunk your money in an earn out rolled equity or something like that, seller's note, there are other monetization events like an ESOP to say, well, if you're going to do all that work anyways, you can get your money out. But back to your point about the net proceeds, the 1042 on the C Corp increases your net proceeds at closing, but you might be able to be on the board collecting income. And, if you wanted to be the CEO, you could still reinvest back in the business. You got warrants there's all these mechanisms here's been my thesis, Jeff, and I want to know what you think about it, is like, if you took two sales neck for neck, or neck to neck, that's the right way to put it, or side by side, sorry, is let's say one was like 13 or $15 million and one was $10 million enterprise value at the closing. Let's say the 13 to $14 million one was third party. The ESOP, if the person was willing to be roughly involved, moving to a board or something like that, 1042 C Corp, net proceeds, warrants, the mezzanine financing on the pre-tax dollars and reinvesting potentially in their own ESOP, I swear to God that the net proceeds over 5 to 7 years would be more with an ESOP, even though the premium was paid on the third party.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's many times the case.
Okay.
And part of our feasibility analysis kind of shows what the true economics are to someone to sell to an ESOP structure, and kind of what the all-in sort of dollars you can expect, not just day one, but over, say, a 5, 6, 7 year period of time.
Because you're going back to your own internal rate of return with all the stream of cash flows and what all those warrants would be in year 5 to 7, right? And then what's your level of control over that, right? If you already have the plan, and this kind of goes back to how important those assumptions are. Because if you are said a different way, I've tried to explain to people, you can't bamboozle a third party. You're not going to get them to pay you all this money up front and have these hypothetical assumptions that aren't there, because
too sophisticated.
You're going to end up bearing that risk in execution some way or another, right?
Yeah. There's going to be some risk sharing for sure, and that's where you need to know kind of what the underlying assumptions are, and the likelihood that this second bite of the apple might actually come to fruition. Because if the assumptions are so grandiose and unlikely to be achieved, then you're really not probably going to see any sort of secondary benefit at some point in time in the future. So it's definitely something that kind of has to be balanced and weighed. But a lot of times what we find is through this feasibility process that it doesn't always yield a result that says now's the time to hit the go button. Sometimes it's insightful in saying, you know what, now's not the time to hit the go button, and here's why. You've maybe your business isn't performing as great as the market. Your market's not going to value your performance because of these factors. Your margins, are lower than what buyers are looking for. Your growth trajectory is not all that appealing. You've got too much customer concentration. It's going to impact your your pricing multiple and value, and so a lot of times, if anything, it provides the insight to say, okay, well, what do I need to do to make my company a better asset and more appealing, to the buyers?
So in that feasibility study, are you guys going through some of those drivers?
Well, what we would do is we identify the strengths and the attributes of the company. I'll certainly identify maybe some deficiencies, room for improvement, and then the marketplace places a lot of weight at any one point in time on certain attributes, right? And certain sectors are maybe more attractive and appealing at any point in time than others. There's capital being rotated out of one sector into another because of macroeconomic sort of trends and dynamics or expectations of
is that flowing into the industry place in the weighted average cost of capital, which is underpinning the multiple. So like, as like, with COVID and things went back and forth to different industries, home services is all hot. So they're kind of placing that risk profile on that industry and the size. I mean, is that how that's showing up into that value?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's certainly how it would show up in the value and higher, weighted average discount rates, which would lower value. But sometimes we will identify these things, and then from there it's okay. Let's put together a strategic analysis, right? This is what we think your value is today in the marketplace, given all these attributes. And if you put certain plans in place today that are meant to improve the attributes where maybe currently you're somewhat deficient, and you do that, 3 years from now your value might be over here, this much higher, right? And then that would be a better result, and a better economic result, for you. And
are you like pulling levers in like a 3-statement model then to show them that, or like, or just no way, really?
Yeah.
That's like,
and sometimes it's qualitative stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes it's qualitative stuff. I mean, and sometimes it's quantitative stuff. So it's kind of a blend of each. It's sort of, hey, if you can, you've got a new line of business that's sort of in its infancy stages, right? And this line of business isn't contributing much today, but this is what the marketplace covets. It's just you don't have a lot of depth and breadth right there. So if you could build out this area and generate a higher percentage of your revenue coming from this infant sort of line of business, you're going to attract a wider universe of buyers. And anytime
can I double click on that? Because let me give you a situation with my clients. So commercial cleaning business, 7-figure EBITDA, and we're working through different decision trees right now. And so she's an owner operator, and there's enough free cash flow to hire someone. So like literally we're like, hire someone or sell right now. It's like, and all signs are pointing to hire someone. But there's a commercial cleaning, but like there's in that marketplace, ancillary services like maintenance of light bulbs and like fixing the plumbing and stuff like that, where you're not licensed and all that stuff, but you're just like the first call response for all that stuff. There's all this strategic plan built out, but there's not any execution. I'm like, if we hire someone and then execute on that for 12 to 24 months, not only will you have a president in there, so you don't have to do it, but then also it's going to go from a story to proof.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like, and you as the investment banker could actually say, like, here's exactly what happened, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's demonstratable, right? You can show it. It's the proof of concept. The company did this, they executed on it. And obviously, presumably if you've done that, you've generated incremental revenue and earnings, which is only going to improve your value in a variety of different ways, particularly if it's a new line of business, right? I mean,
right.
Now you're more diversified, and people like diversification. You're not so beholden.
Well, you can place those assumptions with more confidence, right? Like, hey, if we could go into these markets, well, we have X amount of customers that don't have that. We can now put that assumption that like we've already recognized this, and we can. I mean, those assumptions that you're working through become more palatable, right? It's not just some pie in the sky idea, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're gonna try to get greater wallet share out of existing customers. We're just scratching the surface of that right now. I mean, we're going to build that out. Okay, well, if I can just do a little bit here each and every single year over how many years, that might be a reasonable assumption, right?
I mean, going back to like, we don't have to talk about much about management buyouts because you're just loading up debt, still have to pay the taxes, and it's about the fundability of that free cash flow, right? I mean, like it's the ESOP situation without all the complexities of the board and everything, but you don't have the tax advantage.
I was going to say it's the ESOP scenario without the tax advantages.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I mean, unless for whatever reason you've got just high net worth individuals that are on your management team that can write a check for your business, which usually is not the case.
I was going to say, how many high net worth individuals have a W-2 paycheck that they just love to work for?
Yeah, exactly. So most of the time, that the management team that buys it from you is going to have to finance the acquisition from you, and they're probably going to have to go, to a bank and borrow some, money and put leverage on the balance sheet, and then probably, in that scenario, there's going to probably be some sort of, seller financing, because you're not going to be able to raise 100 cents on the dollar up front, from a third party bank or other lending, capital provider. Maybe you only get 50% of it up front, which means the other 50% sort of has to be financed by you, the seller, over a certain period of time, which you may not have a problem with, but obviously it's going to require you to be a little bit more patient. And sometimes that's the case, and that's the case with the ESOP structure too. But there's just some other tax attributes that provide the opportunity and ability to perhaps get a little bit more cash at close, since you no longer are seeing cash in the building go sand.
Well, and where I'm trying to be a disciple, Jeff, for the people listening in, is that all roads lead to creating more sustainable free cash flow. Because if you don't, you're going to get dinged on the valuation and the cash at closing. So like you're going to get, like, it's going to come back to you at the monetization event. And then you're going to have to share that risk with someone else that you don't know. And if you just do it yourself, and like this is like essentially it's the ownership framework. Like you have EOS and like scaling up and traction, all that stuff, which are the operating frameworks, Jeff. I've been working on this ownership framework saying like like you got to do this anyways, right? Like either you're going to do it now, and then you're going to generate that free cash flow and generate the options. And like, by the way, the benefit is you extract yourself from the operations, and then it's not as big of a pain in the ass to own the company, but then you free yourself up to like, hey, I could do an ESOP. I could do half up front, half over time. And then it's and then the reason, like, and here's what I'm curious on your perspective is like, I think the reason is not more ESOPs is because people don't do this and they need the PE firm or the third party to do all this work. So that's like, because if you end up doing this work, the net proceeds could potentially be more. And you're creating that strategic plan, the financial model, you're the management team, and like you're handing it off and you're getting paid for that. I guess my point is all roads lead back to doing this work. Otherwise, you're not going to get paid for it.
In some way, shape, or form, you want to, put your business in a position before you take it, before you think about selling it to somebody, to sort of pretty it up, right, and bring the best form of your business to the market that you possibly can. And honestly, if you look at companies in the marketplace that are sort of above average performing businesses, they generally do trade for prices that are more than companies that aren't, above average performing businesses. There's a increased premium for companies that are above average performing relative to those that are not. And that, there's a reason for that. I mean, it's number one, it's
sustainable cash flow value.
I mean, it's worth more, if you're above average performing, clearly. But also, when you look out at the universe of buyers, I mean, everybody would rather have an above average performing business than something that's got a lot of hair on it. And so, you create this supply and demand dynamic, right? You got a very, small number of supply of above average performing businesses and a lot of demand. It's going to create competition, right? And people are going to trip over themselves and willing to pay more and more and more for your asset, because it's hard to find and they don't always come along all that often. And so when they do, people are willing to pay up for it. And so it only behooves, someone that's an owner of the business that's thinking about selling their company maybe 3-5 years out, to start thinking about, well, what do I need to do to really put my company's best foot forward so I can create that experience for me.
Right. Well, I want to just interject there for a second, because like, I think what I found for the last 10 years is the word exit and the word selling. It's like this allergic reaction that people have. They don't know if they mean the job versus the asset. You and I have talked about that in some previous conversations. And this idea of extract yourself from the freaking operations and create sustainable distributions for yourself. You can do whatever you want. And then but then you're thinking about capital allocation. It doesn't inherently mean sell the business to PE. It's like, because like, so many people say I turned into an ESOP. Like, okay, because you didn't change anything dramatically about the operations. And that's why I've been so stuck on this concept, Jeff, of by building all these plans out, the first domino that falls is you can actually get out of the job. Like, isn't that an awesome situation that frees yourself up? And if you do that hard work to get out of the job, which is what most people want anyways, then it actually layers or levels you up to have all of these choices. And the best part is you don't need it. So like there's all of the self-reinforcing good things that happen from let's work on getting out of the job and collecting your income through distributions without suffocating the growth. And then what I want for people that I'm working with or listening in is talking to people like you and Butcher Joseph to say, when is the time from a monetization event that aligns with one of those doors of the feasibility, right? But it's not out of desperation because I'm tired of my job. It's a capital allocation discussion and deal structure discussion and matching up. And like, how much more fun is that for you, by the way, when like people get that stuff? Because you and I aren't arguing about, is this this iPhone 100 grand or $1,000? We're arguing like, how do you set up your iPhone? How do you like Droid? You know what I mean? It's like, it's a fun conversation about what really is value. And I don't know if you've realized like, this is kind of where outside of all that psychological or that operational stuff is, I feel like the macro environment of the lending and the last 15 years of really screwed up, overvalued deal structures where like, there's this world of like, you're not getting all your cash up front because there's been this 15 year of 0% interest that allowed people to do this roll up dump. And like, I saw this article that showed where the PE firms are getting their returns from. And it was like debt payout and like multiple expansion. And then like operational efficiencies went from like 15% to like 70% of like the value. Like we meaning capitalism has to create more cash flow. Like it has to be done. And the lending environment, all this stuff is impacting, I think, people's desire to understand this conversation that we're having, Jeff. And that way they're not having to like, it's not the Ozempic pen BS. We're like, I just jam this in and then I become healthy. It's like, you have to go to the gym, eat well, sleep well. Actually, like the normal discipline has to be the name of the game. I don't know, like as we go kind of the big macro picture, like, am I on track, do you think, with how I'm thinking about that?
Oh yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think, it's harder in this environment today to just kind of generate a certain rate of return simply through financial engineering.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, it has to come from operational improvements in a lot of ways today. And so I think that chart that you're referring to there, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that. I don't know what that source was, but I think it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't surprise me because it is hard.
You got to do the hard work, right?
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah. And so that's also why, I mean, we've seen a little bit, in the last, I don't know, 3 to 4 months, where there's still activity in the marketplace. There's still transactions taking place, but deal volume is going to be better than 23. But it's on a slower trajectory. I think what's happening is you got a lot of buyers that are really focused on their existing portfolio of investments and trying to improve the operations.
Let's get rid of that AS400, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
They know mainframe. I can't even believe it.
Yeah, I think everyone kind of realized that, listen, we do have to roll up our sleeves and get our fingers dirty a little bit and improve the operations if we want to, continue to drive shareholder value. And so I think there is a little bit of that going on for sure. Anecdotally, it's interesting to see you saw it in sort of chart form.
Well, and I'll have to find that because I can picture the article, and if I can find that, I can send it over to you. But also as we're kind of wrapping up here, like where I'm trying to get with this conversation with my material, Jeff, and like talking to people like you, is that like the last 15 years from 2008 to 2022, essentially, it was like, I read this article about someone in the bond market. It was like running on that conveyor belt in the airport while you're flying by everybody. And then you just went wham and you just like stopped. It's like, because you were constantly refinancing and everything was cheaper. And like, so like for 15 years, operational efficiencies actually could be put to the side because this like constant, normalized EBITDA, clob it together, multiple expansion, hand it off to someone else. But like it's a flaming bag of what, because at some point that roll up has to generate free cash flow. And I just think that people like reality has started to set in, and therefore people ignoring your advice or my advice is less of a thing, because it's like they're starting to realize like, oh, that buddy that sold that like had to roll half of it and he didn't get any of it and he's had a boss for 4 years. So those like, euphoria stories I think are kind of fizzling out. I mean, I don't know if you're seeing that, because I think that's a good thing for you, because I think like Butcher Joseph and having the slew of different buyers that you can help you with, the feasibility study, it's so valuable for people to understand those options, because they're not sitting there going, dude, my buddy got 20 times EBITDA and like I don't have any like of any of the stuff that you're telling me I should do. It's back to like everybody's taking the Ozempic pen and you're telling me I need to go to the gym. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, that's sometimes the worst enemy is, somebody knows a guy that sold his business for something, and it's like, well, I don't know, did he or didn't he? Okay, there's probably more to that story. Oh, it was 6 years ago. Yeah, that deal rule doesn't exist anymore.
Well, and like, what I even found is complication to even further complicate the situation is, the first like the 3 or 4 years of this podcast, Jeff, that I started doing in 2016 and 17, I was interviewing people about their exit stories. And what would happen is they get on the podcast, they tell this glamorous story. We'd hit the hit the stop recording button. Like, dude, I rolled half the equity. I'm totally screwed. I hate them. I had a panic attack on the plane. And I'm like, I'm not doing my audience any justice that like we're lying. Oh, it's like, well, you're lying because you have $4 million rolled equity and you're going to get sued if you tell the truth. So I think it's just, I know I've already taken enough of your time that we could keep going. This has been so fun. And I know we normally do the quarterly updates, and we're going to get those rolling after the first of the year here. Any last thoughts on the macro environment or things to be thinking about as we move into, I mean, there's a new administration coming in that's got different thought processes than the previous one. I mean,
yeah, for sure. It's going to be interesting to see, obviously this new administration, all the different initiatives and things that they want to do. I mean, I think we'll continue to see over time an improvement in the debt capital markets and the cost of money. I mean, I think everybody's kind of under the of the opinion that the interest rates will come down, and that will make obviously debt cheaper than it is today. At what pace it comes down, I think, is to be debated.
And one thing that I'm watching, and I'm curious when we circle back with ITR and yourself, is that even though Powell's reducing rates, if the money supply growth is happening, the banks can't actually take on lower rates because they're at risk of having a bad investment because of that. So like, rates went down and mortgage rates went up. And so this is the first time since back, in the 30s where like you have this decoupling of that situation. And so I'm curious on how bank lenders or like senior lenders and SBA lenders are viewing the business transaction world, because we can see it in the mortgage market where it's like, they didn't go down even though the rates went down. And the reason is because these banks need to overcome their risk of inflation. And so I don't know if you're seeing some of that, or you're expecting those lower rates to come into the capital markets.
Well, we'll see it trickle in. Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, I think we'll see it, selectively in the lending community. It's going to depend on a particular asset, right? And I think, people are always looking to put money to work. So again, if you have an above performing business, you'll have banks that will be more willing to be competitive on rates, as opposed to the opposite. Just like buyers.
Always comes back to do the hard work.
It always comes back to, generating, the cash flows and being able to demonstrate the ability to do that certainly helps in a variety of ways. There's this whole proliferation of the non-bank market, and they're just not regulated like the traditional commercial lenders are. And that's a really interesting area. Yeah, they're super active right now. They've got a lot of money to put to work, and it's a real viable universe of capital for the right companies. It's hard for really small companies to kind of tap that marketplace. But if you've got some size, that's a
Because they're
really
kind of
good,
like replacing conventional loans. That you're not talking about SBA loan kind of
not
competition,
SBA
but like,
loan.
Jeff, I've seen it where like some of the big family offices that I know, they're doing debt funds to get
Mhm.
a 10% rate of return,
Yeah.
and they're pooling together different people that want part of their portfolio, and they're like, hey, we'll go find,
Private capital markets, yeah, the
yeah,
private
yeah,
capital debt markets, exactly, and that's, that's something that's become
interesting,
very active, and there's a
yep,
lot of dollars in that marketplace, and a lot of people are realizing that it's a good sort of, again, diversification, right? To kind
yep.
of, provide a different avenue for their investors.
Well, back to as we wrap up here, like understanding the markets like you guys do and the different types of buyers, what are the desired rates of return from the debt and the equity structures that are coming to be the buyers, like what you guys understand, I think is unbelievably important because so many times people listening in, they go talk to one advisor and that one advisor's anecdotal, light little teeny slice of the world, they extrapolate to the entire marketplace. And it's just not the case because, like you said, new options are coming through. We just need to find a home for the capital and match up their return
Yeah,
profiles.
yeah, find the best partner for the business going forward.
So reach out to Butcher Joseph. I know Jack has got, and your team has got a lot of good resources on Butcher Joseph's website. We'll have a link to that. I don't think we've talked about that feasibility study. Usually I kind of correlate that to an ESOP feasibility, but it sounds like for all the different types of buyers. So best place to reach out is just the website, or any other place you guys want to point them?
Yeah, website's always a great starting point. My information's on the website, all my contact information, so you can go to website under the team, find my email and phone number, and feel free to reach out.
Jeff, thanks so much. This has been so much fun.
My pleasure, Ryan. Thank you.
Oh man, I hope you're enjoying the journey. I know I'm probably getting into the weeds, but I'm having a lot of fun. Hopefully, you're finding these conversations beneficial. Jeff did a great job of breaking down the different types of buyers. What are their goals for rates of return? How do they plan on getting them? How does the deal structure impact their ability to get the returns? And I think understanding the ownership structure and their goals for free cash flow, internal rate of return, the timeline is super important if you want to match up your goals and what you want for the business. Because when that new structure happens, it'll impact the operations. Because my whole deal is that the ownership goals have to dictate the operations. And that's just how capitalism works. And the more clear we are, the more we can see how our goals could match up with a private equity firm versus an ESOP versus a third party. And we can get to the root of the question, which is, do our goals match up? And then how do they impact your desire for net proceeds and your personal goals? But what we're trying to do is goal match here. And hopefully this is helpful. Next week on the episode with Dave Deal, we're going to be really diving into deal structures, because the deal structure is a way to mitigate risk outside of the purchase price, right? Because someone can say, I want $20 million for your business, but okay, how much is in cash? How much is in seller notes? How much is in rolled equity? How much is in earnouts? Well, all of those different mechanisms are different ways to make sure that that buyer is going to be able to get their rate of return in their timeline as with the highest amount of possibility. So understanding these puzzle pieces, or I should say these chess pieces on this chessboard, is really important. So that way you can dictate your time and you can figure out whether you want to pursue a deal, not pursue a deal, if you're aligned with a buyer, not aligned with a buyer. And understanding this game, I think, brings more freedom because you can then use your time more wisely. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I will see you next week.